There is a courtroom in Chicago, Illinois, that on one cold Tuesday morning in November looked like any other courtroom in America. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. The smell of old wood and fresh anxiety hanging in the air. Rows of polished benches filled with journalists, spectators, and people whose lives were about to change forever. The bailiff stood at the door. The judge adjusted her glasses. And then a woman walked in. She was 38 years old. Her name was Savannah Keller. She wore a charcoal gray blazer, her natural hair pulled back with quiet elegance, and she moved through that courtroom the way water moves through a narrow space, with absolute certainty and zero wasted energy. She set her briefcase on the table, opened it, and without looking up at the man sitting on the opposite side of the room, she said, and every person in that courtroom heard her, "Your Honor, my client didn't just lose her job. She lost her identity. And the man who took it is sitting right there." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room like smoke. And Theodore Voss, one of the most powerful men in Chicago, CEO of the Voss Meridian Group, a man who had never once in 61 years looked genuinely afraid of anything, went pale. Can you believe that moment? Can you imagine being in that room? Stay right here, because what brought Savannah Keller to that courtroom on that Tuesday morning is one of the most extraordinary stories you will ever hear. And we are just getting started. If you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell right now, because this channel is where stories like this live. Let's go back to the beginning. Savannah Keller did not grow up in a world that handed her anything. She grew up on the south side of Chicago in a narrow two-story house with chipped yellow paint and a porch that leaned slightly to the left. She grew up with her grandmother, Diane Keller, a 74-year-old woman with silver locks, hands that could knead bread and comfort a grieving child with equal tenderness, and a faith so deep it was practically geological. Diane went to church every Sunday, kept a garden of tomatoes and collard greens in the backyard, and raised Savannah as her own from the time Savannah was 9 years old. Because when Savannah was 9 years old, her mother disappeared. Not disappeared the way people sometimes disappear, in the slow, painful way of drift and distance. Not a mother who moved away or started a new family or simply stopped calling. Lydia Keller vanished on a Wednesday in October, without a note, without a warning, without any explanation that a 9-year-old girl could understand. One morning she was there, making oatmeal in the kitchen, humming something low and sweet, and by that evening, she was gone. And nobody could tell Savannah where. Diane told her that her mother had to go away for a while, that she loved her, that she would understand when she was older. But older came, and the understanding never did. It became instead the kind of wound that scars over but never fully heals, the kind you forget about for months at a time until something small, a smell, a song, a woman's voice in a grocery store, tears it open again. Savannah became a lawyer because of that wound. She studied pre-law at Northwestern, went to the University of Chicago Law School, graduated in the top 3% of her class, and spent the first 7 years of her career as a civil rights attorney, fighting for people who had been overlooked, underpaid, and underestimated. She was exceptional at it. She had the kind of courtroom presence that made opposing counsel sweat before she even opened her mouth. But exceptional doesn't always mean financially comfortable. And so at 35, after years of nonprofit salary and student loan statements that seemed to reproduce overnight, Savannah made a difficult decision. She moved into corporate law. It paid 4 times what she'd been making. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she could always go back. She put the civil rights work in a drawer and told herself it would still be there when she was ready. She was not ready for what corporate law was about to show her. Her apartment in Lincoln Park was sleek and minimal, a place that looked like someone lived there in theory but not in practice. One couch, one bookshelf with law texts and 3 novels she'd never finished. A kitchen table she used as a second desk, and on the refrigerator, held in place by a plain silver magnet, a photograph. A woman in her early 30s, laughing at something outside the frame. Natural hair, a gap between her front teeth, eyes shaped exactly like Savannah's. Lydia Keller, the only photo Savannah had. Every night when Savannah came home, she looked at that photo. She had been privately searching for her mother for 20 years. She had hired a private investigator at 26 who turned up nothing. She had submitted DNA to ancestry databases. She had written letters to social services offices and gotten form responses. Nothing. It was as though Lydia Keller had not just left, she had been erased. And Savannah, who argued cases for a living, who built arguments from dust and turned them into verdicts, could not crack this one. So she kept the photo on the refrigerator and she kept living her life. And she kept telling herself that one day the answer would find her if she couldn't find it first. She had no idea how close that day was. It was a Monday morning in early September when Savannah's supervising partner, a tall silver-haired man named Gerald Pace, called her into his office and told her he had a new assignment. The Voss Meridian Group, one of the firm's most important clients, was facing a wrongful termination lawsuit from a former employee. The case needed to be handled quietly and quickly. No media attention, no extended discovery, just a clean settlement and a signed NDA. Is that going to be a problem? Gerald asked. Savannah said no. She was a lawyer. Clean settlements were a perfectly legal part of the work. She didn't ask why the client wanted it settled so fast. She would think about that question later. She would think about it a great deal. The plaintiff's name was Ruth Alcott, 58 years old. She had worked for Voss Meridian for 11 years as an administrative records manager in their corporate archives division, essentially the person responsible for organizing, cataloging, and maintaining the paper and digital trail of one of Chicago's largest real estate development companies. She had been terminated 8 months earlier. The stated reason was organizational restructuring. Ruth's attorney, a small, sharp woman named Patricia Osei, argued it was retaliation. Retaliation for what, specifically, Savannah did not yet know. Ruth's full deposition was sealed pending settlement negotiations. Patricia Osei had filed it under a temporary confidentiality order. Savannah made a note to request access through proper channels. Her first meeting with Theodore Voss happened on a Wednesday. He met her in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of the Voss Meridian headquarters, with Lake Michigan visible in the background like a painting someone had hung to impress visitors. He was charming. That was the first thing you noticed about Theodore Voss. He was the kind of charming that professional people learn to wear like a second skin. Warm handshake, easy smile, first-name basis within 30 seconds, the kind of eye contact that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. He told Savannah he was grateful to have her on the case. He told her he had every confidence it would be resolved swiftly. He described Ruth Alcott as a good employee who had taken a difficult transition personally. She's confused, he said, smoothing his tie. We all feel for her. But a lawsuit isn't the answer. Savannah nodded and said all the appropriate things and wrote down everything he said, and on the elevator ride down to the lobby, she felt something she couldn't immediately name. A low hum of unease, like a frequency playing just below the range of normal hearing. She shook it off. She was a professional. She had a job to do. The unease came back 3 days later when she was going through the discovery materials her paralegal had compiled from Voss Meridian's own document production. Boxes of files, both physical and digital, covering the scope of Ruth Alcott's employment. Performance reviews, all satisfactory to excellent. Internal communications, routine. Project records from the archives division, standard. And then, in a folder near the bottom of the third box, a photocopy of an internal memo dated 31 years ago. It was administrative in nature, a routing slip for interdepartmental correspondence, the kind of document that existed in every large organization and meant almost nothing to almost everyone. Savannah's eye moved across it automatically, out of professional habit, not expectation. And then she stopped. At the bottom of the routing slip, in the field marked Received By, was a name written in faded blue ink. 2 words, a first name and a last name. The kind of name that lived in the locked room at the back of Savannah's mind. The room she had spent 29 years trying to open. Lydia Keller. Savannah sat very still for a long time. The kind of still that is not calm. The kind that is the moment before something breaks. She picked up the memo with both hands. She read it again. Then again. The name didn't change. Her mother's name. Her exact name. First and last. In a document from Voss Meridian Group dated 1 year before Lydia disappeared. Which meant her mother had worked here. Which meant her mother had been inside this company. Which meant that the corporation Savannah had been hired to protect had some connection to the woman she had been searching for her entire adult life. What would you do in that moment? Seriously, drop your answer in the comments below. What would you do if you were Savannah Keller, sitting in a conference room with that piece of paper in your hands? She did what every great lawyer does when they find something they weren't supposed to find. She made a copy, put the original back exactly where she found it, and said absolutely nothing to anyone. But she started digging. That night, she went to see Diane. Her grandmother's house still smelled the same as it did when Savannah was a child, lavender and pine sol, and something always simmering on the stove. Diane was in the living room watching her evening programs, a crocheted blanket across her lap, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked up when Savannah came in and smiled the smile that had been Savannah's entire world for most of her life. Savannah sat down across from her. She put the photocopy of the memo on the coffee table between them. She watched her grandmother's face. Diane looked at the paper. She looked at the name. And something happened behind her eyes that Savannah had never seen before in 74 years of knowing this woman. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. Deep, quiet, old recognition. The kind that means you already knew. Grandma, Savannah said, very quietly. Did you know she worked there? Diane looked up from the paper. Her hands were in her lap. They were shaking. She said nothing. She pressed her lips together and she looked at her granddaughter with eyes that were full, not of tears exactly, but of something that had been held for too long, and she said nothing. And in that silence, Savannah understood that her grandmother knew something, had known it for a very long time, and had chosen, for reasons Savannah did not yet understand, to stay silent. Savannah drove home alone. She sat in her car outside her building in the dark for a long time. And for the first time in years, not in a courtroom, not arguing emotion, not in any professional context where composure was armor, she fell apart. Quietly, in the front seat of her car, in the dark, on a Tuesday night in September. She pressed her hands over her face and she let herself feel the weight of 29 years of not knowing, and the specific terrible feeling of being closer to the answer than she had ever been and still not being able to touch it. Then she wiped her face, walked inside, opened her laptop, and got back to work. This story is only getting started, and I promise you, it is going to places you are not expecting. If you are watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, now is absolutely the time. Hit that button. We are going deeper. The next morning, Savannah requested access to Ruth Alcott's sealed deposition through proper legal channels, citing its relevance to settlement negotiations. The request was approved. The deposition transcripts arrived on a Friday afternoon, and Savannah read them at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold and untouched. Ruth Alcott was not a woman who spoke in circles. Her deposition was direct, detailed, and delivered in the measured tones of someone who had been preparing to say these things for a long time. She described her 11 years at Voss Meridian with the clarity of someone who had paid attention, really paid attention, to the world around her. She described her role in the archives division. She described the day, for years into her tenure, when she had been tasked with digitizing a section of physical records from the company's pre-digital era, documents going back 40 years. And she described what she found in those records. Internal contracts, government housing grants, documentation related to a series of federally funded low-income housing developments that Voss Meridian had managed across Chicago in the late 1980s and early 90s. Thousands of units. Tens of millions of dollars in federal funding. Communities of people, predominantly black families on the south and west sides, who had been promised safe, quality housing. Ruth had found evidence that those contracts had been falsified, that cost reports had been manipulated, that the company had been billing the federal government for construction standards they were not meeting while pocketing the difference, that families were living in substandard conditions in buildings that on paper were compliant and in reality were not. She had also found something else. Evidence that someone inside the company had discovered the same fraud 29 years earlier. Someone who had compiled documentation. Someone who had been preparing to go to the authorities. And evidence that this person had been identified, threatened, and systematically neutralized. Their employment records altered. Their internal communications deleted. Their personnel files scrubbed so thoroughly that if you looked for them in the Voss Meridian system today, you would find nothing. The name of that person was in Ruth's deposition. 3 syllables. 2 words. Lydia Keller. Savannah had to read the paragraph 3 times before she could breathe properly. Her mother had not just worked at Voss Meridian. Her mother had been a whistleblower. Her mother had found the fraud. The same fraud Ruth Alcott had found 2 decades later, and she had tried to expose it. And someone, the deposition did not name who specifically, but indicated that the order had come from the executive level, had made sure she never got the chance. Savannah closed the deposition transcript. She sat with her hands flat on the table. She thought about Theodore Voss in his glass office with the lake behind him, charming and easy, describing her mother's erasure as something that had never happened. The hum of unease she had felt on that elevator was a scream now. She called Marcus Holt. Marcus was a mid-level attorney at the same firm, quiet, steady, the kind of man who did exactly what he said he would do and never asked for credit. He and Savannah had been colleagues for 3 years and cautious friends for 2. He was one of the only people at the firm she trusted without reservation. He answered on the second ring. "I need you to trust me," she said. "And I need you to be ready." There was a pause. "Ready for what?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But something big." Another pause. "Okay," he said. That was the whole conversation. That was Marcus. The following week, Savannah requested a second meeting with Ruth Alcott. Not through formal legal channels, but a direct conversation, attorney to potential witness. Patricia Osei, Ruth's attorney, approved the meeting with conditions. They met in a coffee shop on the north side, away from any Voss Meridian adjacency. Ruth Alcott was a heavy-set black woman with short natural hair going silver at the temples and eyes that had seen enough to stop being shocked by most things. She wore a green sweater, and she ordered black coffee, and she looked at Savannah across the table with the assessing gaze of someone who was deciding whether to trust her. "You're their lawyer," Ruth said. "I'm aware," Savannah said. "So why are you here talking to me like this?" Savannah looked at her steadily. "Because I read your deposition. All of it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, And my mother's name is in it." Ruth looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Savannah started to wonder if she'd made a mistake. Then something shifted in Ruth's face, something softened, and something hardened simultaneously, and she reached into the bag at her feet and produced a sealed manila envelope. "I've been waiting," Ruth said, "to see if you were who I thought you were." She slid the envelope across the table. Savannah opened it. Inside were documents. Physical photocopies of internal Voss Meridian communications from 3 decades ago. Memos. Authorization signatures. A chain of correspondence that mapped, clearly and without ambiguity, the decision to discredit Lydia Keller, destroy her employment records, and, the phrase used in one memo, clinical and horrifying in its casualness, manage her situation permanently. And at the bottom of several of those authorization signatures, a name that by now Savannah could have written in her sleep. Theodore Voss, not yet CEO in those days, then a senior vice president, rising, ambitious, and apparently willing to do whatever it took. Savannah looked up from the documents. Ruth was watching her. She was brave, Ruth said quietly. Your mother, braver than most people would have been. She had everything documented. She was ready to go to the Federal Housing Authority. And they found out. And they buried her. Where is she? Savannah asked. The question came out barely above a whisper. Ruth shook her head slowly. That I don't know. I know she didn't die. The memo suggests she was coerced, forced to leave, given a new identity. The language is vague, but the implication is that she had no choice. She paused. But she's out there somewhere, honey. I believe that. Savannah drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. She kept glancing at it at red lights like it might dissolve, like she was dreaming. She had spent 29 years with a hole in her life shaped exactly like her mother. And now she was holding in her hands the blueprints of how that hole was made. She was not sad. She was not even, primarily, angry. She was cold and clear in the way that happens when grief turns into purpose. The next morning, she filed paperwork to withdraw as counsel for Voss Meridian Group, citing a conflict of interest without specifying its nature. Gerald Pace called her 3 times in 1 hour. She let it go to voicemail. Then she called Patricia Osei. I want to represent Ruth Alcott, she said. There was a long pause on the other end. That's not a small decision, Patricia said. No, Savannah agreed. It's not. Another pause. I'll need to talk to Ruth. She already knows, Savannah said. I talked to her this morning. Ruth Alcott's lawsuit against Voss Meridian Group, which had begun as a wrongful termination case, was now about to become something much larger. With Savannah aboard, and with the documents Ruth had preserved, the case expanded to include allegations of large-scale federal contract fraud, destruction of evidence, witness intimidation, and cover-up spanning 3 decades. Federal housing authorities were notified. The Department of Justice opened a preliminary inquiry, and Theodore Voss, who had not survived 61 years of corporate warfare by being slow, moved immediately. His legal team filed motions to suppress. They challenged Savannah's conflict of interest disclosure as improper. They subpoenaed her former communications with the firm. They questioned whether the documents Ruth had provided were obtained legally. They were thorough and they were ruthless, and they came at Savannah from every direction at once. And then Theodore Voss called her personally. It was a Sunday evening. She was at her kitchen table reviewing case notes. Her phone rang, unknown number. She answered. Ms. Keller. His voice was the same as it had been in the glass conference room. Warm, measured, certain of itself. I think we should talk. We're talking, Savannah said. And she reached across the table with her free hand and pressed record on her phone. What followed was a masterclass in how powerful people threaten other people while maintaining plausible deniability. Theodore Voss did not say anything overtly illegal. He spoke in the language of concern and opportunity. He expressed worry about the direction the case was taking. He described, at length, the settlement offer his team was prepared to make, to Ruth, and separately to Savannah, as compensation for the disruption to her career. The number he named was substantial, life-changing by most measures. This doesn't need to go any further, he said. You're a talented attorney. You have a future. Don't throw it away on a case you can't win. I appreciate the advice, Savannah said. I'll be in touch. She ended the call. She saved the recording. She sent a copy to Marcus. She sent a copy to a secure cloud account. She emailed a copy to Patricia Osei. And then she sat back in her chair and looked at the photo of her mother on the refrigerator. I'm coming, she said. To the photo, to the empty apartment, to the 30 years of silence. I'm almost there. Are you still with me? Because this is the moment everything converges. This is the moment 29 years of silence is about to become the loudest thing in a Chicago courtroom. Don't go anywhere. Don't even think about it. The trial, when it came, was not quiet. It could not have been quiet. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the Department of Justice had opened a full investigation. 3 former Voss Meridian employees had come forward as additional witnesses, and every major news outlet in Chicago had a reporter in the gallery. The story had broken 10 days earlier through an investigative piece in the Chicago Tribune. Details of the fraudulent housing contracts, the displaced families, the decades of cover-up. The piece did not mention Lydia Keller by name. Savannah had made sure of that. Her mother's name was for the courtroom. Her mother's name was hers to bring home. Theodore Voss arrived at the courthouse on the first day of trial in a dark suit with his legal team arranged around him like a wall. He did not look pale the way he had on that first morning. He had recovered his composure. He looked like a man who had survived worse and expected to survive this. Savannah let him look that way. She had learned, over 16 years of law, that composure is not the same as control, and she intended to take both from him before this was over. Her opening statement lasted 40 minutes, and not a single person in that courtroom moved or checked their phone or whispered to their neighbor. She laid out the case with the precision of a surgeon and the force of someone who had a personal stake that went beyond any professional obligation. She described the housing fraud. She described the families displaced. She described Ruth Alcott's discovery and the retaliation that followed. And she described, with perfect legal clarity and barely contained emotion, what had been done to a woman named Lydia Keller 30 years ago, inside this corporation, under the authorization of the man sitting at the defendant's table. She did not cry, but the woman in the second row of the gallery, a journalist from the Tribune, did. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. The documents Ruth had preserved were authenticated. The recorded phone call was admitted into evidence over strenuous objection from Theodore's legal team. Former employees testified. Federal housing officials testified. Marcus Holt, who had spent the past 6 weeks quietly and brilliantly compiling financial analysis of the falsified contracts, testified about the numbers, the specific amounts, the specific falsifications, the specific beneficiaries. And then came the moment no one in the courtroom was expecting. Savannah called her final witness. She said the name quietly. The plaintiff calls Diane Keller. There was a murmur in the gallery. Theodore Voss leaned toward his attorney. His attorney shook his head slightly, as if to say he didn't know either. Diane Keller walked into that courtroom in a navy blue dress with silver buttons. her silver locks pinned neatly at the back of her head, her reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She was 74 years old, and she walked with the measured dignity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. She sat in the witness stand. She looked at Savannah, and she folded her hands in her lap the way she did when she was ready. "Ms. Keller," Savannah began, "you are the grandmother of the plaintiff's lead attorney, is that correct?" "I am," Diane said. "And you were the primary caregiver for Savannah Keller from the age of 9, following the disappearance of her mother, Lydia Keller?" "I was." "Ms. Keller," Savannah paused for just a moment, and in that pause was every drive home from school, every Sunday dinner, every night her grandmother had held a secret so heavy it had bent her and not broken her. "Did Lydia Keller contact you before she disappeared?" Diane looked at her granddaughter. Then she straightened her back, and she said, "Yes. She called me. The night before." The courtroom was absolutely silent. "What did she tell you?" "She told me she had found something at work. Something that was going to hurt people if it didn't come out. She told me she was scared. She told me she had been warned to stop. She wouldn't tell me by who. She said it was safer if I didn't know. She told me to take care of Savannah if something happened to her." Diane's voice was steady. Her hands were still. "And then something happened to her." "Did you know," Savannah asked, and her voice was perfectly controlled, "that the company she was referring to was Voss Meridian Group?" "I knew the name," Diane said. "I didn't know what they were exactly. I knew they were the ones who had threatened my child. I knew it was connected to her work. I kept what she told me because I was afraid. I was afraid for my granddaughter. I was afraid if I spoke, whatever they had done to Lydia would come for us too." She paused. "I have carried that fear for 30 years. And I am done carrying it." Theodore Voss's attorney stood up. "Objection, Your Honor." "Overruled," said the judge, without looking up from her notes. Diane looked across the courtroom. Not at the judge, not at the gallery, at Theodore Voss, directly at him, with the full weight of 30 years. He looked away first. Savannah had one more question. "Ms. Keller," she said, "in all the years since your daughter disappeared, did you ever stop believing she was alive?" Diane was quiet for a moment. "No," she said finally. "I never did." She looked at Savannah. "Neither did you." There was no dramatic outburst. No Hollywood moment of Theodore Voss leaping to his feet and confessing. What happened was quieter and more devastating than that. What happened was that the judge looked at the evidence compiled before her, the documents, the testimony, the recordings, the financial analysis, and found it sufficient. The jury found it more than sufficient. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Theodore Voss and Voss Meridian Group were found liable on all counts. Federal charges followed the civil verdict within the week. The falsified housing contracts, representing over $40 million in fraudulent billing across a decade, were referred to the Department of Justice for full prosecution. Theodore Voss, who had spent 30 years behind the insulation of wealth and lawyers and charm, was going to federal court. And this time, the charm wasn't going to be enough. Ruth Alcott was awarded full reinstatement compensation and the largest wrongful termination settlement in the history of Illinois employment law. She stood on the courthouse steps and held Patricia Osei's hand and said she hoped the families who had lived in those buildings got every penny they were owed. She said she hoped they got an apology, though she didn't expect one. She said she hoped that the next person who found something they weren't supposed to find would know they weren't alone. And the court-ordered document releases that followed, the full unsealing of Voss Meridian's records as part of the federal investigation, gave Savannah the last piece she had been searching for her entire life. Her mother's name. Her mother's new name. The one she had been given, or taken, or survived under. The details were still being untangled by investigators. And an address. A small town in Georgia. A white house on a quiet road. A woman who had been living very carefully, very quietly, for 3 decades. A woman who had been made to disappear and had been disappearing ever since, because she had never known whether it was safe to stop. Savannah drove to Georgia on a Saturday morning. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't call ahead. Some things you cannot prepare for. Some things you can only do. The road was quieter the further south she drove. The trees got fuller. The sky opened up. She had the radio off and the windows down, and she drove for 9 hours thinking about nothing and everything at the same time. About a 9-year-old girl eating oatmeal in a Chicago kitchen. About a woman who had been brave enough to try to do the right thing and had paid for it with 30 years of her life. about what it means to fight for people who have no power against people who have all of it, about whether courage is worth the cost it always seems to demand. She turned onto the road the GPS directed her to. It was a long road. Oak trees on both sides. Late afternoon light coming through in shafts. She slowed down. The house was white. Small. A garden in the front with late-season flowers she couldn't name. A porch with 2 chairs. A screen door. She parked the car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel. She thought about what she would say. She realized there was nothing to plan. She got out of the car. The screen door opened before she reached the porch. A woman stepped out. She was in her mid-60s. Natural hair, mostly silver. A gap between her front teeth. Eyes shaped exactly like Savannah's. She stopped on the top step. She looked at Savannah. Her hand went to her mouth. Savannah stopped walking. She couldn't speak. She had spent 29 years building arguments, constructing sentences, turning silence into sound in courtrooms and boardrooms, and every professional space she had ever inhabited. And now, standing at the bottom of these 3 porch steps, looking up at the woman on the photograph on her refrigerator, she had nothing. No words. No argument. No prepared statement. Lydia Keller walked down the steps. 1 step. 2 steps. 3. She stopped directly in front of her daughter. She looked at her for a long, long moment. At the blazer, at the set of her shoulders, at the face she had last seen on a 9-year-old, and whatever she saw there made her breathe out a sound that was not quite a word but meant everything. She opened her arms, and Savannah walked into them. They stood there for a long time in the afternoon light on that quiet Georgia road. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying. 30 years of it, unwinding slowly, like something that had been wound too tight for too long finally being given permission to release. And sometimes, not always, not easily, not without cost, but sometimes, that is exactly what the truth does. It finds its way through, past the people who buried it, past the fear that kept it hidden, past the years and the distance and the silence. It finds its way home. There are thousands of families across Chicago who lived in those buildings. Families who paid rent on homes that were not what they were promised. Families who raised children in conditions that a corporation had certified as safe and known were not. For them, the legal process is ongoing. For them, justice is still a road being built. But it is being built because Ruth Alcott refused to be quiet. Because Savannah Keller refused to let the story disappear. Because Diane Keller, at 74 years old, sat in a witness stand and finally put down a weight she had been carrying for 30 years. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to stay silent. In the face of systems that are built to erase you. In the face of people who have every resource and every advantage. In the face of 30 years of carefully constructed silence, courage, and love, and the refusal to give up, they always find a way through. The truth behind the silence was never just a legal case. It was a mother. It was a daughter. It was a grandmother who kept the faith when faith was all she had. It was a woman who found something she wasn't supposed to find and told the truth about it anyway. It was a lawyer who looked at a piece of paper with her mother's name on it and made a choice that changed everything. It was every person who has ever stood at the edge of what they know and had to decide whether to keep going. They kept going. And so can you. If this story moved you, if you felt something watching it, share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth has a way of surviving. Leave a comment below telling me what moment hit you the hardest. Was it Diane on that witness stand? Was it the drive to Georgia? Was it Savannah sitting in her car, finally falling apart? Tell me. I read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, truly, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button. Hit the notification bell. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories about people who fought back. Stories about courage that doesn't look like a movie but feels like real life. Stories that remind you what human beings are capable of when they decide that silence is no longer an option. This has been the truth behind the silence. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.